I can remember walking by a lot of people in the community that were along the main road, and I knew something was going on because everybody was very quiet. A lot of people were just looking at each other, not saying anything. And now that I look back on it, it was people probably in a little bit of fear about what was about to happen.
And that was really just as the word was coming out that the federal police forces had started using violence against the students.
No matter who you are and what you believe and where you're from, I think it's fairly universally accepted that you can't shoot people for peacefully protesting. You can't put people in jail for peacefully protesting.
We know that 4 people were shot in the middle of town. We know 2 were killed behind us. We know that there were bodies near one of the primary schools near the university.
This demonstration showcases how fragile the Ethiopian government is.
Since late April 2014, thousands of students across the Oromo region have been peacefully protesting against an Ethiopian government land grab.
Integration without our nation, without our nation, involvement is nothing.
The plan stands to displace millions of indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands.
My name is Jennifer. In Oromo, I am known as the wife of Iyasu. And my husband and I were Peace Corps volunteers in a town called Ambo, which is in the western Oromo region. And we were there for 20 months.
We were invited to serve as Peace Corps volunteers in Ethiopia in the health project. So we packed up and we went through training, and then we were placed in Ambo, and we've been living there for about 20 months. We had been living there for 20 months up until about a month ago when we came home.
In and around the capital of the country, Addis Ababa, over 200,000 of these residents have been removed from their lands without proper compensation since 2005.
They couldn't say exactly what was going on. They just said that the students have some problem, but they couldn't say exactly what. So we listened to the protests for the rest of the morning, and the road was closed for the whole morning. And then in the afternoon, we talked to some friends at the university, and they told us about the Addis expansion plan or master plan. And I guess the students and other people had been demonstrating against that.
The current Ethiopian government has evicted millions of indigenous peoples from their homelands at gunpoint under the pretext of development since it took power.
Every few minutes we were hearing gunshots. Sometimes we would hear what sounded like an explosion, followed by a round of 30 or 40 gunshots sometimes. There were gunshots within a block or 2 of our house. They were very close.
Yeah. In the early afternoon, there was a lot of smoke coming from the east side of town, and people told us that it was from cars being burned and buildings being burned.
And the protesters had they had gathered as big of rocks as they could, and they barricaded the road. So the main road, which goes out to the western corridor of Oromo, which goes right through Ambo, was shut down for the entire day. Basically, nobody could, get in or out of Ambo. And, for most of the day, we were just, in our compound, just listening to constant gunshots.
In order to understand the Oromo protests, it is important to understand the Oromos and their relationship with the Ethiopian state. The Oromo, who are indigenous to East Africa, are the single largest ethnic group in the region, constituting over 40% of Ethiopia's population. Afan Oromo, the native tongue of the Oromo, is the 4th most widely spoken language in Africa.
My first encounters with the Oromo community were when I was a high school teacher. I had students who were newly arrived refugees from Ethiopia, most of whom were Oromos, and their families had been persecuted because of their political views. And so I learned very quickly as we worked in the classroom together about their experiences. And that was largely one of the reasons I decided to go into law, is to become a human rights attorney, to do something more about the human rights violations that were happening in East Africa, and including with the Oromo people. So it's in that context of education and my context as a teacher of Oromo students that it really strikes at my heart what's been happening with the student protests in Ethiopia.
The newly announced Integrated Development Master Plan for Addis Ababa, known simply as the Master Plan, seeks to legalize past land grab activities and to consolidate larger areas of territory, displacing native peoples from their land.
I've heard it from many different perspectives and can't see how that is overlooked on a global scale and how that's allowed to occur. Because not only is that just oppressing Oromo people, but it's giving them nowhere to go after. Like when they lose their farmland, maybe they're not educated to go into the city and work, and it just contributes to this cycle of oppression that we're seeing now.
The government's response to the protests has been ruthlessly violent, as its special forces have indiscriminately shot into crowds.
The gunshot was so close, it frightened both of us a lot. And we waited for a little while, and then we asked some people, a young man that had carried 2 bodies from the compound behind us. They carried their bodies to the local clinic, and they died. The police had followed them into their compound while the protests were on the opposite side of town. They followed them into their compound and they shot them in their compound. And that's when Jen and I were very frightened, and we couldn't believe that the police would enter somebody's private home and shoot them in their home. It was awful.
It bothers me that we don't see that on the news.
The main reason there's not very much international attention about what's happening in Ethiopia is that you don't have independent media and bloggers on the ground who are free to write about what's going on and publish pictures and videos. And so to the extent we know anything, it's largely because of the context between the people on the ground and the Oromo diaspora around the world.
And, you know, we have to be very careful about what we say. We can't say names. We can't, you know, give out specifics, because if we do, we're very fearful that, you know, the Ethiopian government can just arrest people for any reason that they have. It doesn't matter. And that's one thing that we haven't said so far, is that each day there were many people that were arrested, many people.
The government of Ethiopia doesn't necessarily want the world to know what's been happening with the student protests, that federal forces have used violence against the students, that there have been mass arrests of students, that there are allegations that people who have been arrested have faced beatings and brutality. Those things the government of Ethiopia doesn't want the world to know about, because they, of course, don't make the government of Ethiopia look very good. And so the government doesn't have any incentive to allow outside forces, to outside entities to come in and do an investigation. And so there are certain barriers to spreading the word.
We think that's most scary about what's going on is that people are not allowed to say anything. And if they say anything, the slightest small thing, they'll go to jail. And it's so people have absolutely no voice at all. It's really sad.
Children as young as 11 years old have been killed, according to a statement issued by Amnesty International on May 13th. Due to Ethiopian government's tight control over information flow, it has not been possible to determine the exact number of victims of the retaliation against Oromo protesters. In the first 2 weeks alone, over 50 students were reported killed by the government's special forces, the Agazi Commandos. Thanks to social media and mobile technology, a view of the scale of the crisis is emerging.
We heard the federal police driving around our neighborhood at night, and they were talking on their bullhorn, and I think it was in Amharic because we didn't understand it. So we later found out that they were saying, like, stay in your compound tonight and tomorrow, don't leave your houses. The police were saying this. And then on Thursday morning, a Peace Corps driver came to get us. The U.S. Embassy called the police in Ambo to request our release, and we had to sit at the police station for quite a while, maybe 20 minutes or something. And while we were there, we saw lots and lots of people coming in at gunpoint, being brought into the police station. And we saw lots and lots of people coming into the prison at gunpoint, visibly beaten or injured. And the prison was so full. They were coming in on a big bus and lots of smaller trucks, like in the back of trucks.
About an hour later, we were finally officially released to leave Ambo, and then we drove out of town.
With each changing regime, state power has been retained in the hands of minority rulers, and the Oromos, living on the richest land, have remained the main targets of Ethiopian state repression, terrorism, and discrimination.
People thought that we were spies, and we thought that was a little amusing because we don't even speak the language. And what would we be spying on? Because we're just working on very simple health projects. And, you know, we kind of experienced that in people's attitudes, that the thought that, you know, they were being spied upon. And we experienced that for the 20 months that we were there. And then after the protests and the violence in Ambo, we were evacuated to Addis, into the capital. And while we were staying at a hotel there were these two men that wanted to really start a conversation with us. They tried really hard. And everything about them was suspicious. They said, they're from Minnesota. And we said, oh my gosh, we're from Minnesota too. And they said, we're from St. Paul. And we said, we're from St. Paul too. And then one of them pulled out a driver's license from Minnesota, which looked painfully fake. And it said Worthington, Minnesota, which is hours away from St. Paul. And then, you know, we tried to keep our distance with them, and just everything about them was very suspicious. And they kind of started following us. You know, we would be sitting at a table, and then they would have to sit right next to us. Or if we sat at a table outside, they would sort of troll back and forth by us, you know, walking slowly, just like so many times to try and, I guess, listen to what we were saying.
And then we went to a restaurant outside of the hotel, and this man followed us about a mile and then sat right next to our table. Like he joined in another couple's dinner, like sat at their table just to be close to our table. For whatever reason they were following us or whomever they were, we just completely stopped talking about the protests and about everything. We didn't say anything unless it was sort of in person, like on a whispering level, just like everybody else in Oromia does. We had sort of become Oromo at that point.
The modern Ethiopian state has been predicated upon the expropriation of Oromo lands and held together through violent assimilationist policies, the destruction of the identity of conquered and resistant people, and economic and political exploitation of groups who are not represented in government. Despite mounting reports about its human rights abuses, the Ethiopian government has enjoyed the protection of the United States and other Western countries as an ally in the war on terror. Ethiopia has been one of the top recipients of Western foreign aid over the last 2 decades, receiving billions of dollars.
There should be protests against this. The Oromos have a lot to lose from this happening, and this plan came out very quickly, and the government admits that it didn't do a good job of getting the word out and letting people know about it and creating a community dialogue. And then in retaliation, they have to keep order, and the way that they keep order is it's
frightening.
It's very frightening, and it's very frightening for the people, and it's very frightening for our democracy.
People go to school and they get an education so that they can change the world, and these kids are trying to change their situation and they're being killed. That's not okay. As a student, I'm learning and I'm getting an education with the future in mind, and these kids' futures are being denied.
These are students from the ages of 7th grade to high school to university students, and by putting your future in prison, what hopes does your country have?
It's very important that the Oromo students that are protesting know that people around the world are listening and are sympathetic to what's happening.
I was just in Ethiopia 4 years ago, and to think that if I was still around, if I was still in Ethiopia, I'd be one of the students protesting, or worse, one of the ones who have died and lost their future.
Inuman tikse malekula to ashufe badaloninga abisu. Inuman rafe malaya lami tokuma dabu namara abisu. Allayan allayuma maltu allaya. Nuru fajadai alagana laguma maltu alaga adam firajadai koborta ormina batu yo abano fi batate malay roro ormarra dufte roro dina radufte maltu namado. Oh, abado wata male malo. Biya orma adakun naman ibu galun naman ibay. Biya ofi yagadi sa garbo adun naman argu jaran. Chamsa dufta mo birra aya sa wilenko saya nobori. Chamsa sinufno birra. Chamsa sinufnu birra kinufnu kalo nutti bitani kalo nutti bitani furdanna nalbe dannu fitani malo jabbiloota koo ya jabbiloota odaa jalaa kan nama nyaatu nu keessa jira jabbiloota koo ya jabbiloota odaa jalaa kan nama nyaatu nu keessa jira amaaloo